Okay, let's see. The video's finished processing. And now the checks are good. We'll just set the publish date. And we are good to go. Very nice.
You've got mail.
What's this? Oh, the professor wrote back to me. Well, let's take a look at that. Very interesting. Oh, and there's more studies. Oh, look at this. And look at this. This is an important piece of information. Oh, that means I'm going to have to re-record the video. Hey gang, welcome to my channel. Your old pal Black Swan here, back with another video, and this is sort of a response to something that happened on Twitter. And as the intro kind of alludes to, I already sort of recorded this once, but then I got more information. So I really felt like I needed to come back and give it another go and include some more information. Now, this came up in a conversation of Twitter, and I will post it here or there, wherever seems right. And the idea that came up is that babies are intuitive theists, someone mentioned. The idea that Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi posted a little thing about it, and my response was that that wasn't offered as an argument for atheism. It was just to highlight the idea that atheism is innate. Atheism is innate and theism is learned. And this fellow Inspiring Christianity came back and sort of refuted that point. And we went back and forth a little bit. He made some good points. I think there was also some miscommunication there. So I thought I would get into this a little bit. So here we go. So the first thing I'd like to say, as far as I'm concerned, the idea of calling an infant specifically an atheist is kind of silly. I think for terms like theist and atheist to have any kind of meaning, we have to be speaking in reference to entities that are capable of forming and holding complex and abstract beliefs. You wouldn't call a rock an atheist, or a houseplant, or a goldfish. It just doesn't make any sense. It's a non-applicable label to those kinds of situations. And for that same reason, for me personally, I think the idea of calling an infant specifically an atheist really just doesn't make any sense. Yes, they lack a God belief, but they aren't capable of holding God beliefs. They aren't capable of holding any real beliefs. They haven't developed that level of cognition yet. So that's why I think specifically in the case of atheists, in the case of babies, which is really what I was referring to in my initial comment that I made here, I don't think the label even really applies. Now, also in my initial response, I think I had something very specific in my mind with the word theism. It is often used to denote a sort of a specific idea of a creator God, and like the Abrahamic faiths, although it also applies to pantheons, I guess anybody that has a god. So I think I sort of had that creator God monotheistic idea in my head, where the term can be applied a little more broadly than that. And that's kind of where it intersects what we're talking about with young children specifically. Now, what is at the crux of this is this idea that young children have a tendency to assign artifice or teleology to natural or inanimate objects. For example, if you ask a child, why are there clouds? They'll tell you the clouds are there to make rain. If you ask them, why is there rain? They'll tell you because the plants need to be watered. They think of natural things with this utilitarian or artifice concept, but it goes beyond just the utilitarian aspect of it. they apparently have this tendency to view things as being made. Not just that they're there for a purpose, but they are actually constructed. And that's sort of at the heart of this. Now, again, we're talking about children that are old enough to verbalize these kinds of concepts. So it's a little hard to say how early these beliefs might start and what form they first take. But by the time children can verbalize these things, they're looking at the world in this way. Now, in my conversation with Inspiring Christianity, he first posted this article from Evolutionary News, or evolutionnews.org, which is a mouthpiece for the Discovery Institute. It is a propaganda machine, and I wasn't going to waste my time reading that. Even if they smattered some actual science in there, they demonstrably do not know how to handle science because they argue from creationism. So it's a garbage website. It's not worth my time to go look at. But I asked him if he could link to the actual studies that were referenced in the thing. And he provided me links which were behind paywalls and apparently was under the impression that I wasn't going to bother reading anything. I asked him if he knew of anything that wasn't behind a paywall, and he didn't respond to me. But I took the time to actually not only find the study that was being referenced, but sent an email to the author of the study, and she was very kind enough to reply to me, and also sent me links to a couple more studies. And I will link to all of that stuff down below if you're interested in reading it. It's not behind paywalls. It is academic, so chunks of it are pretty dry. The data analysis was like above my pay grade, okay? But the conclusions and the discussions they write about the data are very accessible and understandable. And in this study, they were examining first with children whether or not, actually, let me grab it right here. I've got the papers out. So in this initial study, they were examining, and I'll just read it to you here. This article begins by posing a question: given findings regarding children's beliefs about purpose and their ideas about intentional origins of nature, is it possible that children are intuitive theists insofar as they are predisposed to develop a view of nature as an artifact of non-human design? So they were examining this question, whether or not children have some innate predisposition to view nature as something that is designed. It's a very interesting question. I think one of the tripping points they run into in this study is using the idea intuitive theist, using the phrase intuitive theist. And I feel like especially people like in presuppositionalist types of camps tend to leap on that and point to it and say, haha, we all have this intuitive, this inherent belief that God exists. And that's not what the paper is saying. It's saying that young children have a tendency to view the world as something that is designed or constructed. It's not saying that we know that there's a God, like we're just like rejecting it, like we automatically start with a God belief. That's not really what it's saying. It's also very important to note here that while there may be a predilection towards holding theistic views of the world, artifice views of the world, that doesn't mean that we're born believing a religion. Religions and specific God beliefs are very definitely taught. Those come much later. This is a very generalized kind of thing that they're looking at here. And here's another really interesting piece that came out of this. I just want to read you this sentence here. But also at an applied level to science educators, because the implication is that children's science failures may, in part, result from inherent conflicts between intuitive ideas and the basic tenets of contemporary scientific thought. So what they're saying is sometimes if children struggle with science, it could be in part to the fact that this natural tendency to look at the world as in theistic senses, when we know that the natural world does not operate theistically. We know that clouds are part of a water cycle. They're not put there to water the ground. That you can develop a conflict in there. Now, there were two other studies, as I hook my glasses on my microphone, that I think are very, very interesting because they wanted to study how far this tendency sticks around in adults and how much it's influenced by culture. And this is really interesting. So the first study was in the United States, and I'm going to read the study procedure here. And I think this is really fascinating. Participants were asked to judge whether any being purposefully made the thing in the picture and respond yes or no by pressing the relevant response keys on a computer keyboard. Now, this was a speed task. This was not slowly done. This was using quick response times. And they found in the study that people significantly, adults, even atheist adults, would, in the speed thing, when they're using quick response thought, would tend to look at pictures of natural objects and mark them as designed. And you can read through the studies. They did other controlled studies to see how much that was influenced. Whether or not they could, like they showed geometric images, and the control was if you see a geometric image, click no. So that way they could see if they were being processing at a good speed to where they were actually processing that. But apparently, even in people that don't hold God beliefs, when they don't have time to really process the question properly, they tend to default to nature is a created thing in their thinking processes. This is really very interesting stuff. Now, this first study was in the US. They did a study in Britain. They did a study in Finland. And then there was, all that is in this. And then there was another study done in China to try and filter for like the Western Abrahamic traditions that these other European and American countries would be prone to. And they essentially came up with the same results. Now, it's worth pointing out that these are very small number studies. They're very preliminary. Basically, the results are interesting, and they suggest that more study is required to better understand this phenomena, where it comes from, and how it impacts us. But it's interesting that it came up anyway, and the idea being that we sort of have this inbuilt intuitive sense, wherever it comes from, that things are design that seems to be our default position from a very young age. And that's a really interesting piece. And that's why I think this whole babies are atheists and religions are taught is kind of really doesn't work. It's poorly formed the way it's said. I mean, a lot of these things are poorly formed. Babies aren't atheists, babies aren't theists. I don't think that term applies at all. Religions are taught, but theistic ideas may not be taught. They might be intuitive. So the idea that there is a God, that the world is made and doesn't just exist, does not seem to be, according to these early studies, our intuitive place to be. And that's very interesting. But I'd like to take this to where theists tend to take it. And that is the implications of this study on the discussion about theism and atheism. Assuming it's true that we have an inherent predisposition to view the world as created, what does that tell us about the truth of theism? Absolutely nothing. We can have strange ideas. I mean, we know our intuitive processes aren't always perfect. We know we have cognitive biases and inaccurate ways of viewing the world. That does not in any way inform the question of whether or not a God really exists. That's an entirely separate question. So I see theists sometimes using these types of studies, these studies in particular, as evidence for saying that God really exists, or we sort of know that God exists, or evidence that maybe God exists because we have this intuitive sense of him or something like that. That's not what this is saying at all. It doesn't say we have an intuitive sense that God exists. It's saying that we have an intuitive way, potentially an intuitive way of viewing the world. I think there are implications, however, for theistic beliefs if these studies bear out. So, if this is true, and these beliefs start at a very young age, and we already know that as we get older, we start to shed them. I mean, you ask an adult, what are clouds for? If they know anything about science or whatever, they won't answer in a utilitarian sense. They're part of the water cycle. It's where rain comes from or something like that. But they'll lose that utilitarian line of thinking. So if that's tied to a childish or a very young child way of looking at the world in this utilitarian, this artifice concept, what does it tell us about theism? Is it a childish or primitive way of thinking? Maybe. I think that's an implication. If theists wants to use these studies to sort of defend God ideas or defend God beliefs, I think the implication that we can see how these beliefs begin at a young age and then they're lost. And we can see primitive, more primitive, there's some negative connotations with that word, but less developed groups of people, social groups, have the same thing. They think that the volcanoes happened for a reason. They think that comets are the signs from the gods that they're going to be punished for doing things like that. And we can see these as we gain more knowledge about the world, as we mature out of childhood, we begin to shed those things. So there's an implication there, and I hesitate to say that theistic beliefs are childish because I don't think that they are. I think there are rational reasons why people hold theistic beliefs, even though I don't anymore. There's certainly understandable reasons why. But if theists want to use these studies to sort of support their position, I think they box themselves into the place where that is also an implication. A second really important implication out of this comes from the adult studies that they did and the speed images on the cards. And this is that theistic response was done with that quick decision making area of the brain, which is useful, but it's the least reliable way we have of processing data. It's necessary to be able to make quick snap judgments like that, but you can produce a lot of false positives that way. And again, this goes back to that old saw about proto-humans, early hominids, early humans. On the African plain, you see the grass moving. You've got to make a decision in an instant. Is that a predator or is that the wind? If you guess wrong and it's a predator, you'll lunge. So we developed this system with that really quick thought of getting false positives in there. And it's telling that in these studies, it was only in that quick thought process where that theistic artifice type of response tended to surface. Given time to think and censor one's thoughts and to contemplate the situation or the image, in this case, a little more carefully, then that goes away. So does that suggest that this sort of quick theistic response comes from a place of dubious thinking processes, an area of processing that's known to be error prone? Maybe. I don't want to make any of these assertions as definitive conclusions. And this is one of the things with, I don't know which side the graphic is going to be on, with Inspiring Christianity there. He just came out and said, false. This is false. Bam. And I don't think that's a fair way to present this information because it is not definitive by any stretch. These are small studies. The first study, the one with the adults in the U.S., was 300 and something people, 160 of which are roughly were atheists. Like I said, I'm going to link to everything down below so you'll be able to look at it yourself and read through it. Not to the Evolution News website, though. That's garbage. I'm going to link to the actual studies. These studies are nothing definitive. They're not large scale. As far as I can see, they haven't been repeated. I didn't see any articles that were challenging them. So there's nothing definitive here. We can just really start with that. Second of all, it seems to be that we have an intuitive way of looking at the world that tends to view it as something that is created or formed, very much so with a purpose behind it. That doesn't mean that's how the world is. Those intuitions could very much be wrong. So I don't think it really speaks to the truth of theism or non-theism. And if Christians want to use this to try and point to some intuitive sense that God really exists, I think they raise the specter of these intuitions being primitive, being childish, and coming from a place of flawed reasoning, or very potentially flawed reasoning. A place of reasoning that has a higher error rate than we can think about things more carefully. So anyway, thank you very much for taking the time to watch this little video. This exploration of this question went a lot deeper than I expected to, and it was very interesting. I would like to thank Professor Keleman for actually bothering to respond to my email. I was tickled that she did, and for sharing with me the documents that I'm going to share with you. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, you can thumbs down. That's okay. I don't judge. Remember to share this and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to get more content like this. And our bedtime stories, you can watch those too. As always, be kind to one another. Take time to really think about these things. Even if they kind of rub you against the grain, because I know it rubbed me against the grain when I first saw it. And I've had some interactions with some atheists on Twitter, and it clearly rubs them against the grain too. But if it's what the science is telling us, then it's what the science is telling us. What we make of that is an entirely different question. But we shouldn't be afraid of accepting reality, even if it's a reality that we don't like, right? And I will see you all later.